Pete Garratt, can I invite you to give us an operational perspective on the challenges for the Red Cross in responding to disasters in an urban context?
I'll do my best. Hello everyone, thank you for the opportunity today. I'm going to talk about disaster response, particularly obviously in an urban context. I will talk generally about disaster response, and I will talk generally about humanitarian agencies. I'll illustrate it with some practical sort of examples from disasters, some of which are familiar to everyone, some of which perhaps are less known. I think firstly to say, I really just welcome this kind of the growing attention to the issues of urban risk and disasters in an urban context. In many ways, I think we would probably acknowledge an overdue focus and one that's very welcome. It's clearly a really complex area, and I think that complexity, for me, just really accentuates the challenges that humanitarian agencies face in disaster response in general, in many ways. Some of the points I'm going to make, you might say, well, it's the same whether it's in a rural area or an urban area, and to an extent that's true, but I just think the complexities of the urban context are making it even more important that we as humanitarian agencies address the challenges that we face. So what are those challenges? I'm going to look at three in particular. Firstly, around how we target, how we identify those that we're going to work with when responding to disasters. Secondly, our choice of intervention tool or methodology that we use. And thirdly, the area of, well, you've responded, what next? Bluntly put, how do you as a humanitarian agency leave, exit, move on? When can you do that? When's comfortable to do that? So on that first area of targeting in an urban environment, and I think Haiti, and I'll come back to Haiti from time to time, really brings this out. When you're trying to do an assessment in an urban area, it is very challenging. Contexts are demographically very fluid. There are incredible inequalities exaggerated by relative wealth right next to desperate poverty. Many settlements are incredibly transitory, informal, shifting populations. I mean, we really saw this in Haiti as we were trying to do assessments. Word would get out and people would up sticks and shift across the city to try and take advantage of a perceived aid might be coming here or there, which presented us in the humanitarian community with a real challenge. Community-based and geographical targeting is therefore often relatively ineffective. Indeed, that sense of community, traditionally in the humanitarian sector, it used to perhaps working with rural populations or a displaced group of people in a camp. Very easy, relatively, to pick up on who's affected. But that sense of community, much harder to pin down. Not impossible at all. And I think that's why we can't, as humanitarian agencies, sort of walk away and say it's too hard, it's too complex. We have to front up because it isn't impossible. So the traditional targeting that we use might not work. Again, in Haiti, differentiating between those who were earthquake affected and those who perhaps were indirectly affected was incredibly difficult, given the underlying vulnerability and poverty, the chronic issues that were faced in that context. And like many humanitarian organisations, the Red Cross decided to program, to intervene with populations that were both directly affected and indirectly affected, recognising that we couldn't legitimately differentiate in many of those circumstances. Linked to this, and time to sort of front up, working in urban environments is so complex that often I think humanitarian agencies are guilty of working in perhaps easier or perceived to be easier areas in perhaps more rural communities. And I think that has been a reality. The complexities that I've outlined, the difficulties in accessing some of the more dangerous parts of city areas, the problems in targeting, it means that some of the urban population can be overlooked. I mean, Pakistan earthquake, end of 2005, Muzaffarabad, You know, I saw lots of agencies, you know, go up into the valleys and the hills and do fantastic programming in very rural areas. And Muzaffarabad was very much acknowledged as too hard, too difficult. And so, you know, there was a real risk there of urban populations being overlooked. And I think that, you know, that is one in general. You know, and when we're faced with land tenure issues about shelter and reconstruction, and I'll come back to that a bit later, you know, complicated. It is easier for humanitarian agencies to demonstrate impact, doing more with less in rural areas, in my opinion. Which in the current climate, you know, in terms of new government and everything in this country, where we're being asked to demonstrate, you know, really greater levels of impact with smaller resources, then some humanitarian agencies are going to take the easy option. And I think, you know, one of the things I would say is, you know, we as a humanitarian community need to be prepared to take some risks and to work in some of these harder areas, particularly in the urban setting. And I'd also say, but there's a reality, you know, I'm talking about humanitarian agencies, and we certainly cannot do this in isolation. The scale of needs in urban areas are, you know, usually very much beyond the scope of most humanitarian aid organisations. Let me just refer to Djibouti, where British Red Cross, you know, Djibouti is a smallly populated country relatively, but you know, when British Red Cross was looking at setting up originally a food insecurity program, we really focused on a peri-urban poor part of the city, and particularly targeting vulnerable women. And it's a very worthwhile program. I'm not going to talk too much about it. It involves a microfinance program, but it's such a small intervention in the overall context of the longer-term chronic vulnerability that these women and their families and their communities are facing, both in terms of food insecurity and some of the public health issues that Sarah has raised earlier. The requirement, therefore, is for a much more widespread multi-sectoral response, including both humanitarian, development actors and governments. And I know it's very easy to say that, and it's an awful lot harder to make that happen. The second area that I wanted to highlight was the appropriateness of traditional tools and techniques to respond to disasters. And this is a subject, you know, very dear to my heart, and I could go on for hours and send you all to sleep. But the important thing here is that in the sector, I believe we're on a path to smarter forms of responding to disasters, whether it's greater understanding of the role that markets play and how to support markets, whether it's greater use of cash-based programming. And I think that what the urban context does is actually increase the need for us to move quicker down smarter ways of responding to people's need. The prevalence of markets in urban environments, particularly if they've survived the disaster well, and often they bounce back very quickly and quicker than we give them credit for, increases the opportunity, you know, for the smarter use of cash, vouchers, cash or goods in some kind of combination. I think in Haiti we saw very mobile populations moving out to rural areas, moving back to urban areas, to the city, to Port-au-Prince, trying to take advantage of wherever the perceived economic opportunity was. And I think, you know, we as humanitarian actors need to try and support people, and colleagues on the panel have highlighted, you know, react to where people are at, what they want to do. And I think it's one of the things that British Red Cross over the last few years has invested time and effort in developing what we call our household economic security approach, which focuses much more on livelihoods in the immediate disaster response and all the analysis that goes around people's needs, where they're at, the markets, and so on. And you know, these linkages are very complex in urban contexts. But the analysis can be done and they can be understood, and we can respond and support people to recover from disasters. And of course, shelter. I mean, when you think urban contexts, particularly if anyone's worked in a devastating flood situation or an earthquake, where large parts of the city have been damaged. The challenge of shelter and reconstructing people's homes or working with them to do so is really difficult, not least, obviously, the lack of available space. I mean, again in Haiti, in the IDP camps that there wasn't enough space to build sufficient latrines according to sphere standards. That had to be revised according to the existing situation there. Transitional shelters where humanitarian agencies engage in these often become the permanent shelter in urban areas, particularly if the local government entity responsible for housing is unable or unwilling to resolve some of the longer term issues there. Adequate housing in urban areas, legal issues around land ownership, land tenure, often impede resettlement or rebuilding permanent facilities. Earlier this year I visited on a monitoring visit the Philippines in the wake of Typhoon Ketsana from last year, and the huge amount of time and effort the Philippines Red Cross put into lobbying and advocating with government authorities to release suitable land that then vulnerable communities could rebuild on. It's a slow process, and humanitarian agencies have to invest in those local authority connections and recognise that it's not easy and it's not quick wins often. And my last main point, which is how do humanitarian agencies exit from urban environments? My sort of mandate is very much preparing for and responding to disasters. How do we exit when the levels of vulnerability haven't changed ultimately? Who and how do you hand over to? It's another picture from Haiti. There's a line in the World Disasters Report on page 26. Disaster relief agencies cannot address the root causes of why so much of the city's population was heavily impacted. And it's a reference to Haiti, I think. And the International Federation of the Red Cross and Red Crescent recently commissioned a report on sanitation in Haiti in the wake of the earthquake. And it highlighted the fact that many of the areas where humanitarian agencies, including the Red Cross, were providing water and sanitation services never had them before the earthquake. And aid agencies either took on or were given huge responsibilities operating in some of those slum areas in Port-au-Prince. And on the face of it, perhaps little chance of exit. Red Cross continues to provide water and sanitation services for hundreds of thousands of inhabitants in that city. There is clearly a need for longer term investment and innovative solutions, but who will provide these if the government is unable? And I don't have easy answers. I'm very aware, again, throwing up some tough challenges. Real challenge for humanitarian actors to find ways of engaging with local authorities and vulnerable communities, especially on risk reduction initiatives, especially over the longer term, which again, might sit uneasily with those more disaster response orientated humanitarian mandated agencies, indeed such as the Red Cross. This area is a real challenge for us in terms of disaster risk reduction, one we are doing more and more on, but we'll continue to struggle with, I'm sure. So basically, urban context accentuates, I think, the kind of issues that we in the disaster response community are facing in terms of responding to disaster. It makes it more obvious because of the sheer complexity. Not impossible to find a way through. I believe we are adapting, but we can do a lot more for sure.
Thank you, Pete.